Alan and Sean here from the Prancing Pony Podcast, welcoming you to the Tolkien Experience Podcast.
The Tolkien Experience Podcast is an attempt to bring the fan and scholarly communities together around our shared passion, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Each episode features a notable scholar or member of the fan community sharing their Tolkien experience.
And now we'll send you over to Sarah and Luke.
Thanks, Alan. I'm Luke Shelton.
And I'm Sarah Brown.
Every other week, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guest to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any further delay, let me introduce our guest. Before we dive back into the interview, I just wanted to take a moment to remind you that this is the conclusion of our special 2-part interview with Dr. Corey Olsen. If you didn't happen to hear our previous episode, or if you want a quick reminder of what we covered, go ahead and pause this episode now, listen to the prior episode, and then come back. For this episode, we'll pick up right where we left off. So here we go. You kind of anticipated my follow-up because I was going to ask, do you ever think about what your podcast now means for the rural boy in Virginia on a mountaintop?
Yeah. Sometimes I do. It's funny. I remember about maybe 3 years after I started my podcast, there was a guy who came to the college where I taught, and he had been, so he came to the school as a freshman and, sought me out and we had a nice conversation. And he had been a podcast listener from the beginning. So this is somebody who, had been listening to me pretty much throughout his high school experience, and, was, came in and he told me, it's like, I've basically been, listening to your lectures, I've fallen asleep listening to your lectures, every day for the last 4 years of my life. And I'm like, that's actually probably not a good, we're going to need to make some changes to that relationship over the next few years, in some regards. But, anyway, that has been immensely rewarding. I mean, I absolutely, I think of the opportunity, and that's, so when I started the podcast, not when I started it. No, I'm not saying this is the motivation for beginning it, but what I mean is what I found soon after I had started it. The early years of my podcast were, extremely affirming of the idea. I mean, the idea was a sort of a crazy experiment at the time. And really the motivation for it was like an experiment in finding an alternative vehicle for scholarly work. I had begun losing faith in traditional academic publishing, in a sense, just because, again, that desire to share with other people, scholarly publishing didn't do it for me. I was having a personal satisfaction issue because I'd spend all of this time and work, pour so much of myself into, the research and writing, and I'd produce this article and it would get published, and it was not rewarding because I didn't care about the credential, the feather in my cap of having gotten something published. That didn't thrill me because, again, for me, it's always been about sharing with people. And I'd look at my article in this, scholarly journal, and I would be asking myself, who's reading this? Am I really connecting with people? Am I actually sharing this with folks, which is what I want to do? I got massive satisfaction in my classroom teaching experience. I loved that. But scholarly publishing, I'm like, yeah, okay, no, this doesn't do it for me. This doesn't satisfy my desire to share this stuff with people. I'm not saying that other scholars who read scholarly journals aren't real people. They are real people. There just aren't that many of them. And it's not the same. It's just not the same. It's not the same as being able to, I wanted to have my scholarly life, my publication life be more like my teaching life. And so again, so my podcast I initially envisioned it as this sort of alternative publication method, alternative in the sense of like, let's try another vehicle that can reach more people, different people, and more directly in that way. And so the experience of those early years of the podcast was extremely rewarding because the note that was struck by so many people who reached out to me, who emailed me, when they found the podcast was, and again, this is sort of coming back to your question, exactly what I imagine I would have said to, early podcast me had I discovered early podcast me when I was, when I was first reading The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings completely, alone in a house on the top of a mountain. I can't even imagine how my life might have been changed and enriched had I had a community, had I had a point of connection, someone to share. Even like just in listening to, it's clear that, many podcast listeners over the years, even just having like, many of course have connected to the larger online community. And we have, we've always had this very vibrant online community of folks. And, so many people in that community are, Signum University's Mythmoot conference every year is like a family reunion in all the best ways. But even the people who don't connect with other listeners, who don't connect with other members of the community in any kind of active engagement on social media or live participation or attending conferences or any of those things, even the people who just listen to the podcast, it's clear that just like having someone else out there who kind of gets it, sort of feels the same way and shares your enthusiasm. For so many, it's enough. I think that would have been for me. That would have been, because again, it was almost like I didn't know, like know that there was anybody else who felt the same way that I did. It was, again, that's what those college friends who, again, were not people I hung out with or lived with in college, but I could tell Tolkien meant the same thing to them that it meant to me. And I didn't know that there were people like that, until then. So yeah, that would have been, I think, the number one impact that, listening to my future podcast or whatever, or listening to a podcast just like mine by somebody else, if that had been around, in 1986 or 1987, which takes a lot of imagining in several ways. But yeah, that that's I think what it would have meant most, what it most would have meant to me.
So now that I've officially gotten us very far off topic, I need to get us back to our last question,
Sure.
which I think is you've kind of talked about it a little bit, but we
Right.
have the opportunity to do it more directly now. So would you ever recommend Tolkien's work, and why or why not?
In some ways, this is kind of a trickier question than it might sound. I mean, sort of tempted to reply slightly flippantly, and be like, well, obviously, I spend all of my time talking about Tolkien, but actually, it's not that simple. I spend all of my time talking to Tolkien fans who are already Tolkien fans. That's what I spend all of my time doing. As far as recommending Tolkien's work to people who don't know it, or people who are not fans, that I'm actually much more cautious about doing. I'm not saying I never do it, but it's not. It is not true that like everybody I meet or everybody I'm having a conversation with, I'm like, have you read Tolkien? Because you absolutely have to. Like, I don't actually do that much. And one of the things that's most obvious about that is my own children. I have been very careful about pushing Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings on my children. Neither one of my children has read The Lord of the Rings all the way through. Neither of them has. They're 16 and 11 now. My older son, Nicholas, who's 16, he doesn't he doesn't do fiction very much. He's always been a nonfiction kind of guy, which is fine. And so he does not read much fiction for pleasure, period. And he never really got into The Lord of the Rings. I don't think I remember that he did read it. But I don't think he finished it. I'm pretty sure he didn't finish it. One of the reasons I've been very careful with my own kids is I'm not just a Tolkien fan. I'm a professional. This is my job, right? And they've known that. Like, they have known, Daddy is the Tolkien Professor has been a part of their lives since they remember anything. I mean, I launched my podcast when my youngest son was 5. I first made my very first podcast recording when my son was 4. My older son was 4, and when Nicholas was 4. So again, like, there's never been a time of their lives that they remember, and certainly it's well before the birth of my second child. There's never been a time of their lives that they remember when, I haven't been the professional Tolkien guy, giving talks and teaching classes and stuff on Tolkien. So that's Daddy's thing. Like, that's Daddy's job. And I've been very, I have been always been afraid that I am okay. It doesn't make me sad if they don't share my love for Tolkien. What I've always wanted to avoid is for them to be resistant. I've worked very hard to make sure that neither of my children roll their eyes when I talk about Tolkien. Like, that's been the achievement I've gone for, to be like, oh, like, it's Daddy's thing again. Like, oh, do we have to talk about this again? So I never did. I didn't force it on them. I did read The Hobbit to both of them aloud. I didn't force that on them, and I left it there, like, with like an open invitation, like, I'll read you The Lord of the Rings if you want. But I didn't like push it. I didn't sit them down and do that. I don't talk about it that much. I will answer questions about it. And there are interests that they have had in stuff, but again, like, neither one of them has ever completed The Lord of the Rings. And I'm just I'm waiting for them for it to come from them. Because if it doesn't come from them, so it's been hard in some ways, but that is just so that's sort of the most personal example of me. It's not that I'm not recommending Tolkien to them, but I've not pushed it. And I find with a lot of people, Tolkien, like, let's be frank, Tolkien's weird, right? I mean, if you're just like a person who reads who reads modern novels, Tolkien's bizarre. So it's kind of a strange book to recommend in some ways. And of course, as time goes on, it's an increasingly old book. I mean, nowadays, especially with younger people, I mean, if you've got like teenagers and like readers in their 20s, I mean, you think about that. They're not much closer to Tolkien as a contemporary author. They're not much closer to considering Tolkien a contemporary author than they are, like Dickens. Basically, I mean, it's so recommending Tolkien to people is almost like recommending Jane Austen to people. Jane Austen is awesome. She's one of my favorite authors. But again, I don't go around being like, have you read Jane Austen? You totally should, right? Because if someone who just reads modern books, picks up a 19th century novel, it's weird. Like, it's different. It's a different kind of reading experience. And Tolkien is kind of like that. A lot of people pick up The Lord of the Rings and are like, I don't know. I mean, it feels like there's a lot of all or nothing with Tolkien. You'll either not be able to get into it at all, or you will love it and spend the rest of your life reading it. And this is why, for me, the Peter Jackson films have always been a huge net gain, because for me, the primary legacy of the Peter Jackson films is they created a middle space that didn't exist before, right? Because since the Lord of the Rings films not only are films that many, many people have liked, but they have completely entered the culture. Like now, recommending Tolkien is no longer like, hey, so there's this author and he's kind of old and it's pretty weird and it's very different from any other, like, but maybe you'll like it. Instead of doing that, it's like, yeah, so you've heard of the Lord of the Rings, right? So like, about the Lord of the Rings. Like it's part of our culture because of those films and the popularity of those films. Now it's like have you ever read the real books behind those, behind that story that you already kind of know, the references that you get, the memes that you've seen, like it's so it has created that space where Tolkien is familiar. The Tolkien world is familiar to everybody on some level, at least on some level. Even people who in my life, I mean, it was amazing to see that with people like my own parents. I saw The Fellowship of the Ring with my father when it first came out, and he had never read Tolkien in his life at that point. I mean, he knew that it was my thing, of course, and had known since I was little. But much as my parents loved the Chronicles of Narnia, they never had read Tolkien. So, anyway, it's just like, so having seen that even in, within my own family, having seen it create that space where Tolkien is a familiar thing. And there's that kind of ground. I'm always very reluctant to recommend Tolkien cold to somebody who just doesn't know it at all. Because I'm always afraid that if they pick it up and read, I love discussing it with people. I mean, I would always recommend, like when I was teaching my undergrad class, I would always recommend my class, right? Yeah. Like if you're going to take an English class, come take this English class because it's going to be awesome, right? You're going to be having this, sort of guided discussion experience of a book, and you should totally have that experience of this book. But again, just to recommend that somebody, go to their local library, pick up The Fellowship of the Ring and start reading it. I don't do it. I'm cautious about doing that. Because it really is, it's not an acquired taste. That's not what it's like. It's not like that. It's just, it's more like, I don't know, the separation between how Tolkien wrote and the kind of book that The Lord of the Rings is, it is outside our normal mainstream reading experience, right? Now, just as medieval literatures, I don't recommend Chaucer off the street to people either. And he's one of my favorite authors. I would never just be like, oh yeah, you should totally pick up a copy of the Canterbury Tales and just read it. I don't usually do that. But I would try to engage people in a discussion of like what makes Chaucer awesome, in the hope that they will, with some context and motivation, go to it. See, that's my, like, if I recommend Tolkien, that's like my clandestine method. My clandestine method is to have a conversation about things that are awesome about Tolkien in order to inspire them with active curiosity to learn more about Tolkien. Because if they go and start The Fellowship of the Ring with that, within that framework, then things are likely to go better. Whereas if they are sort of looking at a shelf of books and they're like, what should I read, this romance novel, or should I read this, this other modern fantasy book, or should I read The Lord of the Rings? Like if that's the context in which they come to it, I feel like they're likely to just be puzzled. So anyway, that's, if I do recommend it, that's how I recommend it. But more, I think the comparatively few times in which I've actually said to somebody, you really should read Tolkien, is when, like, it has come up, like when something that they are interested in, stimulates me as a teacher into doing one of my, like, oh, Tolkien does that kind of thing all the time, or, oh yeah, Tolkien is huge on this topic. And, if you like that, you should really read The Lord of the Rings, kind of like my cousin did originally, with the Chronicles of Narnia and me. So those are the only people to whom I recommend it cold.
Yeah. So there you have it. Pro tips on definitely not recommending Tolkien, but kind of recommending Tolkien.
Not to recommend Tolkien, exactly.
All right. So the last question I have for you today is, what Tolkien-related projects are you currently working on that listeners could get involved with?
Okay, I have several of those. There are three things that I mean, apart from like our master's degree program in Tolkien studies at Signum University, which is pretty cool and people would like to get involved with. But as far as like my own personal Tolkien projects that I'm doing, there are four. There are four weekly broadcasts that I do that people can participate in live and watch recordings of. The fourth, which I almost forgot to mention, is my Lotro stream. So on Twitch, I do this every week on the Lord of the Rings Online video games official Twitch channel. I do a weekly broadcast there where I'm taking a character through the entire game, basically doing all the stuff in the game, and I spend a lot of time sort of examining what they're doing, especially thinking about the story and how they're interacting with Tolkien's story. But that's also the session in which I do like open Q&A. Like people just come with completely random Tolkien questions, and I will be like my little hobbit in the game will be running around and like slaying orcs and stuff while I'm answering like every absolutely random question that people can come up with. So that's where I do like most free form, just kind of open Q&A kind of stuff.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
Have you ever had to think about a question that you had to go find resources and your character just stood there while you had to go get a book or something?
So often, yeah. And what's more, there are sometimes when, cause like, yeah, basically if my character, I can't like think about more than one thing at once. Like I'm fairly bad at multitasking. So yeah, Grifflet, my character, has spent a lot of time standing around while I talk, because anytime something interesting starts happening in the game that I want to talk about, I'm like, okay, I've just got to freeze and finish what I'm discussing. So I usually try to store it up. Like if I am sent on a quest, like go slay 12 orcs in this encampment or something like that, then I'll be going around and I'll be chasing orcs down and fighting with them, and I can maintain my Q&A discussion, during that. But like once I'm interacting with another character and there's dialogue to be read and the storyline is advancing, yeah, like I've got to freeze. So yeah, I'll be standing there in front of a character with a gold ring above his head for like 15 minutes talking. And there have been some times when people will wander into the stream during that time, right? Because like they're like, oh, let's see what's on Lotro stream. Oh, on Lotro stream is like a character standing there doing nothing while this guy talks, and sometimes I'll see the other people in the Twitch chat like trying to explain what's happening right now. Like, why isn't he doing anything? This is the lamest stream ever, But anyway, so that's one thing that I do every week. And as I say, that's on the Lord of the Rings Online official Twitch stream. So twitch.tv/Lotro stream at 1 p.m. every Eastern time every Friday afternoon. The three other projects that I do, which are sort of longer term projects. One of them was not my idea. The Mythgard Academy was my idea, but the project was not my idea. The Mythgard Academy is a sort of essentially a kind of online book club that I've been running since 2013. And it consists of, it's run essentially by all of the people, all of the donors who donate to support Signum University. All of the donors who make tax-deductible donations to Signum University, which is a great idea, he says, with his university president hat on. But they vote on which books we talk about next. And of course, a lot of them are podcast listeners, and so we do a lot of Tolkien. We have a rule that says we can't discuss any two works by the same author in a row, which functionally means we do Tolkien every other book in the Academy. And they began voting years ago for the volumes of the history of Middle-earth. The Book of Lost Tales Part 1 won the election back in, I think, late 2014 is when that came about, or early 2015, somewhere around there. And ever since then, our Tolkien studies, every other book that we have done in that series has been volume by volume marching through the whole history of Middle-earth. We've now completed 9 volumes of that. We just finished Sauron Defeated. just a little while back, and I have never imagined doing something like that. I mean, I've read the History of Middle-earth series, but doing a like essentially chapter by chapter study of the entire history of Middle-earth is something I never would have, I think, even thought of doing. And it has been such an enriching experience. My goodness, I have learned ridiculous amounts from that study. And just going through together and having these full discussions of the whole progress of Tolkien's sort of creative development has been amazing. So, and all of those discussions are on our YouTube channel. They're on the Mythgard Academy podcast stream, the audio and the video feed, so you can see the passages of text that we're talking about and stuff, are on YouTube, the Signum University YouTube channel. There's separate playlists for all of the Mythgard Academy books that we've talked about. So you can go through and follow along with those. I highly recommend those for people who are like, who've never read the history of Middle-earth and are kind of trying to get into it. It's kind of difficult in a lot of ways. I mean, it's not exactly pleasure reading for even most Tolkien fans, much less most people. But anyway, yeah, that's been really, really fun, and it's still ongoing. We're going to be early next year, probably March, April-ish. We'll be starting Morgoth's Ring. We have 3 more volumes to go, and we're going to carry on doing it. So that's one thing. But again, that's not exactly a project of mine in the sense that that's kind of something that was thrust upon me delightfully, and I've been enjoying doing it, but it's definitely ongoing. The live sessions for that, by the way, are Wednesday evenings, fairly late Eastern time, 10 p.m. Eastern time. So you can participate in the live discussions. Again, you can certainly jump in with Morgoth's Ring, or you can, people can catch up on the earlier stuff. The other 2 projects, which are definitely projects devised by me, though both of them have kind of sort of grown, and are extremely long-term projects, are my Silmarillion Film Project and my Exploring the Lord of the Rings series. The Silmarillion Film Project emerged from, so I did a podcast series called Riddles in the Dark in the years before the Hobbit films came out, when the Hobbit films were announced and everything, and everyone wanted to talk about it. Of course, like my podcast post-dated the Lord of the Rings films, which came out when I was still in grad school. But anyway, so when the Hobbit films were announced, we started this show where we would go through and talk about, with my co-hosts Dave Kale and Trish Lambert, and we would talk about different. So we kind of walked through the Hobbit, not in order through the book, but kind of thematically through the Hobbit, thinking about the challenges of adaptation, of adapting certain parts, and what we thought needed to happen, what we guessed Peter Jackson would do, and all these things. So there's a lot of speculation and a lot of analysis, and it was really, really fun. The only downside to the Riddles in the Dark podcast was like the films themselves. So here, like, we spent all of this time talking about all of the awesome things that could be done, and of course, in the end, we were all fairly disappointed in the actual product. So I decided to do the Silmarillion Film Project because that was. That way we could have all the fun of discussing adaptation without actually having to and be completely free ourselves, rather than to be constrained to any actual film product. So the concept of it is that we are going through and discussing and planning a theoretical adaptation of the Silmarillion in sort of serial TV show form. Actually, so basically, Amazon totally stole their idea from us. Like, that's exactly the kind of show that we've been talking, except we start at the Ino Lindley. So, and it has been a really, really fun experience going through the Silmarillion and thinking about film adaptation. The kinds of questions that raises are really powerful. So many things that I've thought about that I never thought about before. Because when you start asking questions like, okay, but like, how would we tell the story? How do we develop this character's story? How do we, there's so much there. So we're coming towards the end of season 4 now. It's been almost 5 years that this show has been running. We have gotten through season 4 goes through that time when Glaurung escapes and runs amok. That's what happens in the season finale of season 4. Season 4 is basically of Beleriand and its realms, which is the adaptation is a little more action packed than you might expect from that passage of the Silmarillion. But that's basically where we are. And that has been really, really fun. So that's still ongoing. I just, we just did the last live broadcast of that last night. That is happening now on Thursday evenings at 10 p.m. Eastern time. And you can participate on that in Twitch or in a GoToWebinar session that we do. And so that's going to be, we're going to be going off into season 5. Season 5 is going to be from the arrival of men. Episode 1 is going to be Finrod Felagund encountering men, in Osirian. So that's going to be step 1 or episode 1. And it's going to go up through the Dagor Bragollach at the end of the season. So that's what we're getting ready to start doing early next year. And then there's my Exploring the Lord of the Rings class, which is become kind of the signature broadcast that I'm doing. It is, I think, going to end up being the longest running, most in-depth secular discussion of a written work in the history of the world. I think that's again, I will probably have been, beaten in thoroughness by like Talmudic scholars and things like that. But, and by Benedictine monks, but not by much, I think, when it comes down to it. I started Exploring the Lord of the Rings as a much more sort of like the Mythgard Academy. It basically was like, well, I haven't taught through the Lord of the Rings in a while. So why don't I do that a bit more in depth? So we'll do, my thought was like do a week or two per chapter, discuss through the Lord of the Rings. Cause again, just I hadn't in a while. So I wanted to do that. Chapter 1, I ended up doing 4 or 5 episodes on chapter 1. I think it was 4. So I still ended up doing twice as many as I'd originally planned. But then as soon as we got into chapter 2, I started to like more and like to grudge more and more skipping anything. And eventually we settled in to just reading through not chapter by chapter, but in fact, sentence by sentence and paragraph by paragraph all the way through the Lord of the Rings. We now cover several sentences a week. We just completed this past Tuesday session number 31 on many meetings. By far the most, and our sessions are 2 hours long. So that's 62 hours, give or take, of discussion on book 2, chapter 1 of the Fellowship of the Rings. We are the Fellowship of the Rings. So we are in it for the long haul. It's now been almost 3 years that show has been running. The session that we just did was session 123. Yeah. So we're 123 sessions into it, about 246 hours of discussion. And we've not quite gotten to the Council of Elrond yet. When we were in the Flight to the Ford, one of our regular attendees, he's a physics professor. And so he charted it. Like he produced a graph showing the number of weeks that we'd been spending on, and he plotted it to a curve and therefore projected like how long, when we would likely to be finished with the Lord of the Rings at our current pace. And at that point, we were projecting to finish the Lord of the Rings in 2031. But in many meetings, we have slowed down considerably since then. It has become a running joke among people who are participating in that class that, somebody was saying like, okay, so like I have a comment on the siege of Minas Tirith that I am going to bequeath to my heirs in my will, so that when we get to this passage in the book several years after I'm dead, then my son can attend the class and ask my question. It's been really, I mean, it's almost, that class is almost certain to go on for as long as I'm alive. It is delightful. And oh my goodness, like almost every week is this eye-opening experience. There are so many things. Most recently, we literally just left the Hall of Fire. So this past Tuesday, we looked at the passage right after the Eärendil was a Mariner poem. We actually covered the Elbereth Gilthoniel poem this past week. This current week that we're in right now. And that was... so we just literally left the room in the Hall of Fire, and in the Hall of Fire, the conversation between Bilbo and Frodo, when Bilbo, asks to see the ring and everything, my whole view of that passage and of Bilbo as a character were completely transformed. I mean, I don't even know how many dozens of times I have read The Lord of the Rings in my life, and I emerged from that week with a completely different experience of a completely different perspective of that passage of Bilbo, of Frodo. It has been amazing. There's no single thing, though calling something that stretches out over so many years a single thing is a little bit odd, but there's no single experience that I have had that has done more to enrich my experience of The Lord of the Rings than this series. And that certainly, it's something that's ongoing. It's going to carry on being ongoing. If you just, read the book and catch up to where we are, it won't take you too long. If you are a completionist who wants to listen through all the early episodes before you catch up with us and join us live, there are many people who have done that. That's a little bit more of a challenge because there's, 250 hours of listening to catch up with before you get to us. But of course, it's also really just wonderful for people to jump in with the live discussion and everything right away. So that's certainly something that will be going on for quite some time that people can join with, certainly.
Well, all of those sound like fantastic opportunities. So I thank you for providing them.
Hey, it is my privilege.
And I also want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me and to share your Tolkien experience. It's been a really, really wonderful discussion with you today.
Thank you. Yes, this has been a wonderful opportunity, and this is a great project. I'm really glad that you're doing this.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We have a lot of fun making these podcasts.
So much fun. It's always exciting to talk to fans and scholars about their Tolkien experience.
If you want to know more about the ways to connect with this episode's guest that they mentioned in this interview, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. Also, don't forget to follow the podcast on your favourite social media sites.
That's right. We're on Facebook as Tolkien Experience and also on Twitter as @TolkienEXP. So don't forget to like, follow, share, and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking with our guests. You can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I am @LukeB.Shelton.
You can also look for me on Twitter, where I am @AaronLPalmadill. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.